Mike Duffy's court date finally arrived this week. The senator is accused of 31 charges, including fraud, and every corner of his life is being uncovered in this trial. Joining us now for more on that in the nation's capital, Joanna Smith. She's a political reporter in the Toronto Star's Ottawa Bureau. And Joanna, we're happy to welcome you onto TVO tonight for the first time. How are you doing?
I'm great, thanks. Happy to be here.
Terrific. What is this court trying to determine?
This court is trying to determine 4 different things. The first is whether Mike Duffy was eligible to claim living expenses for his home in Canada, because if he had a primary residence in Prince Edward Island, then he'd be eligible to claim living expenses in Canada. So that's one thing. It's also trying to determine whether he was eligible for certain travel expenses that are associated, we're going to hear it, with partisan activities and personal business. We're also trying to determine whether he should have awarded contracts to friends of his for editorial services. And then the really big one is the bribery charge, and that's his acceptance of a $90,000 check from former Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, Nigel Wright.
Okay, well said. Now, most trials, it's either guilty or innocence. Are there... I shouldn't say that, actually. Most trials, it's either guilty or not guilty. It's not necessarily innocence. Right. Are there other potential outcomes in this trial?
Well, there's 31 charges, so each charge, of course, is going to be weighed on its own merits, and it very well could be that, some he may be acquitted on, and some he may be found guilty on. It's obviously too early to tell.
Gotcha. Okay. All of the things you just said, the 4 things, are things that your paper and obviously numerous others have been reporting on for many, many months right now. Admittedly, this trial is only in its first week, but are there any new things that you've actually learned that haven't come out in the past?
Yeah, we've learned a few new things about his travel expenses because the RCMP in its documents filed to the court previously had not laid them out. So we learned, for example, that he took a trip with his wife to visit his daughter and newborn grandson in the hospital on the Senate dime, and spoke at a fundraiser, but then billed the entire trip to the Senate and just called it Senate business. We learned that he took another trip out to BC where he was supposed to have a public engagement with former MP Gary Lunn. That event was canceled, and he spent the time, having dinner with his family, seeing the opening night of his daughter's play, and sort of staying behind at the hotel, I think, while his wife and a friend hiked up Grouse Mountain. And this was all billed to the Senate for about $8,000.
How about
so that's
Peter
one
MacKay?
New thing. Peter MacKay, we've learned, so Mike Duffy kept an extensive diary. It was a calendar that, included all his appointments and speaking engagements, but also includes some really juicy bits from behind the scenes of the Conservative caucus, and his conversations with journalists, his conversations with MPs and other powerful figures. So one thing we learned was that Peter MacKay, who was then defense minister, believed very strongly that Dimitri Soudis, who then worked in the PMO, was behind the scandalous stories about him hitching a ride on a helicopter from Newfoundland, which was obviously a very embarrassing story for the government at the time, and especially Peter MacKay. So we learned that he thought someone was out to get him on that file.
And can we just understand this, why somebody in the Prime Minister's office, a high-ranking official there, with a long history with Stephen Harper, would want to put out disinformation to damage the reputation of one of the government's own cabinet ministers? Why do that?
Well, it's no huge secret that, there's always been rumors about Peter MacKay wanting, perhaps, having leadership aspirations. So this could be possibly a way to stem that and put out some embarrassing stories of him. I mean, there's very little information in there as to exactly why, but those were fears that MacKay had. So when we learn about those fears, we speak to possibly about bigger fears he had, or bigger hopes he had.
Understood. All right, let me go back to that list of the 4 things that this trial is about, starting with the living expenses and why it's important to know where Mike Duffy's primary residence is. Why is that important to know?
It's important because the Senate allows senators to claim living expenses for their time in Ottawa, which only makes sense, really. I mean, if you're appointed as a senator from out of province, you have a home there, but you also need to spend a good chunk of your time in Ottawa. So to compensate them for having to either own a second home here or stay in a hotel or rent an apartment of any kind, they're allowed to claim up to about $22,000 a year in living expenses. So that's rent, that's mortgage, that's hotel fees, that's also per diems, meals, 3 times a day that they're allowed to claim on the Senate dime. So the issue of the expenses and residency here for Mike Duffy is that they're only allowed to claim these living expenses if their primary residence is more than 100 kilometers away from Parliament Hill. So in the case of PEI, obviously that's more than 100 kilometers away. However, the Crown is arguing, did Mike Duffy really live in PEI? How long was he there per year? This is a cottage. It didn't have a winter road. There was no garbage collection in the winter. He didn't pay taxes there. His health insurance was in Ontario. So if that's the case, was his primary residence in fact actually in Canada? And if it was in Canada, then was he really eligible for those secondary living expenses? Was he really on travel status when he was in Ottawa if he had a home here and had a home here for many years?
Duffy seems like, though, one of a number of senators who, although appointed from PEI, spends most of his time not living there, in the same way that, say, Pamela Wallin, while appointed from Saskatchewan, certainly doesn't primarily live in Saskatchewan. Is that common for senators to, quote unquote, represent a province, but actually not spend much time there?
Well, they do need to spend a certain amount of time in Ottawa, right? But what we're learning in court is that, according to Duffy and Duffy's lawyer, Duffy, probably along with Pamela Wallin, was appointed to play what he called a unique senatorial role. So yesterday, the court heard about the partisan activities that Mike Duffy was involved in, and his defense was trying to argue that these partisan activities were very much part of his job, that this is why he was appointed to the Senate on the advice of Prime Minister Stephen Harper. We were shown a photo of the Prime Minister with Duffy, and it was autographed by the Prime Minister. And on it, Harper wrote, thanks for being one of the best appointments, most hardworking senators that there has ever been, essentially. So, Mike Duffy was very much brought in to play a special role where he'd be traveling a lot, giving speeches, and doing stuff very much outside Prince Edward Island and playing a larger role than just representing those regional interests. And that's what his defense lawyer has been arguing all week.
Now, I would imagine that the Prime Minister's people might say, yeah, that's flattery. The Prime Minister signs lots of pictures. He overstates how much he knows and loves the people. Of all the pictures he autographs, I mean, that's possible too, right?
Yeah, of course. But there's also him saying, you have been one of the best, most hardest working appointment. And we see from the calendar just how involved Duffy was on many different files. I mean, he spoke about issues regularly with caucus. People seemed to come to him for advice. He was flying out all over the place to appear at events, both more policy and public business stuff, but also political stuff. He was a big fundraiser for them. I don't know if you remember that email that went out where you could enter your name and then it would say, hey, Steve, it's the old Duff talking. And it was a way to sort of connect with voters and supporters. I mean, he was a celebrity who was appointed to the Senate. And he's arguing and his lawyer's arguing they had much bigger plans for him than just being the guy from PEI.
Now let's understand, though, we know that when members of Parliament in the House of Commons get elected, yes, there's some of the time of the year in Ottawa, but then the rest of the time they're kind of expected to be back in their home constituencies taking care of business there. Is it the same expectation for senators that when they're not in Ottawa, they're back in their home provinces, quote unquote, representing those provincial interests to Ottawa?
Constitutionally, yes, senators are appointed to represent provinces and regions. However, just how far that definition reaches is actually extremely unclear. And in the rules, we've been hearing a lot from the defense lawyer. Being a senator very much involves partisan work, but this whole question of residency and how much time you need to spend in your province is essentially absent, the defense lawyer Donald Bain is arguing. So the Senate is sort of, it's up to the Senate to decide, it's up to the Prime Minister to decide, what a senator is. That's what they're arguing anyway. And if they're successful in that argument, then, it really sort of pokes a hole into this idea that he was not actually resident in PEI.
Okay, so if he's not really from Prince Edward Island, or if he's not really representing Prince Edward Island, or really doesn't live primarily in Prince Edward Island, because his primary residence, it seems, actually is in Ontario, what does that say about the advisability of the Prime Minister appointing him to the Senate in the first place?
It shows that the Prime Minister had a certain role that he wanted him to play. We saw a memo that was written by a political advisor in the office of then government leader of the Senate, Marjorie Le Breton. It was addressed to both Duffy and Senator Pamela Wallin from Saskatchewan on January 6th, which was essentially the day they were sworn in, I believe. And it's addressing concerns about their eligibility for the Senate. And so in this memo, the aide is saying, look, the senator is master of its own house. The eligibility as far as residency and property goes is up to the Senate to decide. It's not a matter for the courts. He said that no senator has ever been disqualified on a residency issue, and that they'd be fine to represent the Senate for the province even if they lived in Ottawa 99% of the time. So we don't know exactly why this memo was written, but it was in response to concerns we were hearing yesterday about whether they were actually eligible to represent those provinces. This is important to keep in mind, separate from the issue of expenses. Duffy's lawyer is trying to argue that if he was okay to sit as a senator for PEI as far as the Constitution is concerned, then therefore his primary residence was necessarily in PEI, because that's the most important part as far as the Constitution is concerned. And if his primary residence was in PEI, then that can only mean his secondary residence was the one in Ottawa. And if his secondary residence is the one in Ottawa, that can only mean that he's eligible for expenses. So that's the crux of the defense's argument on those charges. The Crown, however, has responded in saying, listen, as far as the secondary residence is concerned, that's not even mentioned in the Constitution. The only importance that secondary residence has is about expenses. So you could have a secondary residence, but you didn't actually have to claim those expenses, and that was a choice that McDuffie made. So that's the Crown's argument as far as that's concerned.
Joanna, I gather there was an overflow room set up for journalists on the expectation that everybody and his cousin would want to cover this thing, and that not everybody would be able to fit into the courtroom. Has it in fact been needed?
It has been needed. That's where I was the first couple of days of the trial, actually. We didn't have hundreds and hundreds of people there, but there was definitely a need for more than we were able to fit into the courtroom.
We certainly were under the expectation.
There's been a lot of interest.
Sorry, we were certainly under the expectation that this was going to be one of those kind of Parliament Hill spectacle trials. Is it turning out that way?
It is. I mean, every day when Mike Duffy arrives in the morning, and then when he leaves again in the late afternoon, I mean, there's a mad chase of the cameras following him to the car. We're shouting questions at him, and we're all surrounding him. It was interesting on the very first day, actually. A bit of Mike Duffy's old TV personality came out, I guess, because he actually told his lawyer, who was trying to get him out of the scrum and into the courthouse, that just give these guys a moment to set up. And and then Mr. Bain had to remind him that no, he shouldn't really be saying anything. Please let's move along. So. And I gather he's still Mike Duffy.
He's still Mike Duffy. I gather when he pleaded not guilty, he didn't do it in a quiet, shy, retiring voice either.
No, I mean, that was quite a moment, because he had to stand there while they read all 31 charges, and the charges go into a bit of detail about the travel expenses, and at the very end, he just said, "I am not guilty, Your Honor," and that's all he said in court so far.
Let's get into some discussion of why this thing is so fascinating, because if you look at it, we're talking essentially about a $90,000 check. We're talking about, I guess, what will amount to tens of thousands of dollars of expenditures. This is, for a body that costs $100 million a year to run. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not that much money. Why do you think there's so much fascination about this?
A number of reasons. One, the celebrity factor of Mike Duffy. This is not a senator that no one had heard about before. This was one of their biggest fundraisers. He was already famous before he became a senator. So there's that. But also it's the involvement of the PMO. I think the charge involving Nigel Wright really is the crux of the matter. It's what everyone's attention is focused on. I mean, we have to sit through all these talks of rules and residency and requirements and statutes and the Constitution for a long time, but at the end of the day, Donald Bain, on the end of his first day, then in his opening arguments, hinted at sort of the real big dramatic moments to come, and that would be the testimony of Nigel Wright that we're all waiting for, where he's going to talk about this plan to have Mike Duffy repay the money to make this problem go away. I mean, Donald Bain referred to thousands of emails that were, he got from the PMO, in which Nigel Wright and this small group of people, he called them, referred to it as, our public agony, our Chinese water torture, our public bleeding. This was a really big problem for them, and we are going to learn about what they did to try and make it go away. And we don't get that kind of insight into the behind the scenes of any office very often, and especially not the Prime Minister's office, and especially not this Prime Minister's office.
Right. Well, speaking of spectacle, another senator, I guess suspended senator, showed up this week. Why did Patrick Brazeau come?
Patrick Brazeau came because he said he wanted to be there to support his fellow independent senator. But more importantly, I think Patrick Brazeau came because he, of course, is facing very similar charges when it comes to the fraud and breach of trust related to living expenses. His lawyer was actually there on the first day. Patrick Brazeau came himself yesterday, but his lawyer has been there watching. Whatever is decided in this trial will no doubt have bearing on what happens in Patrick Brazeau's case, because Patrick Brazeau's case doesn't have anything to do with travel expenses or contracts or, bribery from the PMO. It's all about the living expenses. So if Duffy's cleared in living expenses, then Patrick Brazeau, obviously will want to take note.
Okay, so you needed the overflow room for the journalists for the first week of the trial. How about for members of the public? Are there lineups around the courtroom to try to get in?
Not really. I mean, there's been people showing up. One thing that was really funny on the first day was that in the overflow room, they were actually doing a jury selection ahead of time. So they had a big, long lineup of about 200 people. And it was funny to watch the journalists come up the stairs, think that was a lineup to get in the court overflow room, and start freaking out for a moment until we realized that that's not why all those people were there. And of course, the cameras would have loved to see that long line of people. But no, it's very much, you have your regular court watchers, you have some journalism students, you have some articling students, student lawyers who are obviously taking interest and coming in and out and watching, but by and large it is the media.
How much of the public's fascination or lack thereof around this trial do you think stems from, and I refer to the comments by Senator Nancy Ruth the other day, who said she needed the public to pay for her breakfasts because, what was the quote? You only get ice cold camembert and broken crackers on a plane.
Yeah, airplane breakfasts are pretty awful.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is this portrait being painted, if you like, of senators who are increasingly seen as elitist and increasingly seen as out of touch, and that senators, I guess, as we're hearing, live by their own rules. How much of all of that is at play here?
I think that's a huge part of it. I mean, for years, no one has really understood what the Senate does, what function it serves. I mean, it serves to sort of, take a closer look at legislation passed by the House of Commons to make sure, but, these people aren't elected, they're appointed, they get paid handsome salaries far above what the average Canadian does. And so people have always sort of had a lot of questions about the Senate and contempt for the Senate. And this is really bringing out a lot of that the idea that not only in many of the public's eyes do they not really serve any important function, but they're just wasting a lot of taxpayer money through expense accounts, and they're out of touch. And so of course this is playing into it. I mean, Senator Nancy Ruth is quite a funny person, and I believe she was showing her dry sense of humor when she talked about ice cold camembert and broken crackers. But at the same time, if you were looking for a more symbolic quote of the disconnect between the Senate and the public right now on this issue, I don't think you could find it. I mean, I think this was, whether she intended it to be or not, the let them eat cake moment for the Senate, and that's why it was such a quote we all grabbed onto.
Well, she is a fun person, and she also may be the richest woman in Canada, which is why the quote sounded even worse coming out of her mouth. But we got about a minute left here, Joanna. Let me ask you two more quick things. How long is this trial going to go on for?
It's supposed to run until June 19th, but honestly, we are still on. We were still on the first witness for the Crown, the cross-examination. On the fourth day that was going on today. So, it's anyone's guess really how quickly these things will go. Okay. I imagine it would probably stretch past June. If
it stretches past June, and then I imagine we're going to have to wait a little while for a verdict after that. The judge will want to consider it, and there's an election in October. I mean, this is where I'm getting at now. How worried do you think Conservatives are about this playing a role in the October vote?
I mean, it's hard to say, because their argument is that a lot of what we're going to learn at trial we already know. They're not expecting any big bombshells. But I mean, even if that's the case, to have this in the media day after day after day, a reminder that Duffy was appointed by Harper on the advice of Harper, that he was playing a big role for Harper, and this went so badly in the end is just going to sort of feed into people's perceptions that are already there. It's going to feed into cynicism about politics in general. It's not fun for them.
Gotcha. Joanna, it's awfully good of you to be with us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
That's Joanna Smith, political reporter for the Toronto Star in their Ottawa bureau.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.